All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and go through a few items before we get started here with our talk. As we work towards better inclusive practices here at IBS, I have a few brief reminders. We will be using the chat and raise hand features for clarifying questions during the presentation, but please hold all other questions until the end. We have enabled subtitles and the ability to view live transcripts. But if you utilize the CC button at the bottom of the screen, you can view the live transcript and turn on or off the subtitles if needed. I wanted to note that we are recording this meeting. We appreciate being able to see each other, so if you would like to have your camera on, we welcome you to do so. However, we acknowledge that Zoom fatigue is real and there are other reasons for wanting to keep cameras off. Some of you may be eating lunch, so feel free to turn it off as well. If you would like to rename yourself or to include pronouns, please do so. And if you need help with that, please chat with me privately and I can assist. I would like to take this moment to read our land acknowledgement before we get started. Acknowledging that we reside on the homelands of Indigenous peoples is an important step toward recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. The intent of a land acknowledgement is to extend beyond spoken or written words. It must be implemented thoughtfully and meaningfully and be reinforced by direct support and consideration of Indigenous peoples. As we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, and Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands what we now call Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of Indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples and also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. And with that, I will turn things over to Fernando, who will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you very much, Cindy. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor David Cook-Martín, who is Professor of Sociology here at CU Boulder since, what is it, David, 2019 or something like that? Yeah. Yeah, with COVID, I don't know, sorry, it kind of feels like forever. No, I'm kidding. David is a political sociologist with main interests in migration, race, ethnicity, law, and citizenship. He does comparative historical work, mainly or especially, and he has delved on these issues in 3 different ways, at least in 3 different major themes. The first one relates to basically what some migration scholars call ethnic return migration, right? Of especially the descendants of Southern Europeans and ethnic Jews from different parts of Europe back to Europe or to Southern Europe in particular, but some of whom also have migrated, for example, to Israel. But David's first book mainly focused on these folks going to Spain. And with that, he also contributed to the debates around citizenship or dual citizenship as well. So quite interesting set of movements. His second major work with David Fitzgerald, jointly with David Fitzgerald, try to understand the way in which racist immigration policies have diffused across the Americas, mainly across the Americas, although also across other new immigration societies, so to speak, or like Australia to some extent. And also how these racist immigration policies also died out right during the 20th century, and the factors that led to that diffusion and the ebb and flow of those policies. And more recently, the project we're going to hear about today relates to temporary labor migrants in different parts of the world, I believe, especially related to Australia, Canada, the United States, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So without further ado, David's work has been featured in many different kinds of top outlets, has gotten awards, as well as he has a very strong commitment to publishing and writing for broader audiences and trying to kind of translate the the way in which his work is relevant for policy and for public opinion. So he's done op-eds as well as being an active member of the social science network. I'm blanking on the exact name. I'm sorry, the SSN, I guess Social Strategy Scholars Networks, excuse me. And anyway, so David is great both on the deep academic questions as well as on the very, more immediate needs to engage with audiences, which are both very important. So thank you, David, again, and we look forward to hearing about your newest research project.
Thanks, Fernando. It's great to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. I'll share my screen right away here. Everyone can see the screen? Yeah, good. Thank you. So thanks again. It's an honor for me to speak to you all. I welcome the opportunity to engage with a different audience than I might at some of the typical conferences. So thanks for taking the time to do this. I look forward to your feedback as well. So Cindy kind of beat me to this, but hold on. Yeah. I wanted to acknowledge not only the fact that we stand on indigenous lands, but to link this to the topic of migration, because migration is intimately, or has been intimately linked to processes of both expropriation of land as well as extraction of labor. So it seems to me that it's particularly fitting to recognize where we sit from that perspective. Okay, what I'd like to start with is to ask you to think about what comes to mind when someone says migration. And I venture to say that for most people, there will be images of unauthorized crossings over borders. This one happens to be it's an art piece, by the way, those are not actual people. We think of unauthorized migration, people crossing borders, roads, rivers, and so forth. In a country like the United States in particular, that's the way that we often think of migration, or what it brings to mind. There are also other images of migration that frequently come to mind. Refuge. These days, in particular, we may visualize refugees draped in blue and yellow flags crossing from the Ukraine after the invasion by Russia and into Polish territory. Those are, I would say, that two of the most salient images. We may also have images, historical images of people getting off boats in Ellis Island and undertaking a process of becoming part of the American experiment. Now, we should be thinking of dangerous crossings at the US southern border and of people from Central America making harrowing journeys to seek refuge from life-threatening situations, or of Ukrainian refugees pouring into Poland as we speak. These mobilities matter a great deal, especially from the perspective of human suffering. But what do we miss if we reduce migration to its most dramatic instances? Well, first of all, these are a fraction of what geographic mobilities entail worldwide, and of the people that they affect, because there are also the folks who stay behind, right? And they also are part of the migration process. There are more mundane, no less consequential movements of people, which we miss if we focus on unauthorized migration, refuge, and permanent migration. Moreover, if we unproblematically assume that migrants move in one direction, one time, and towards receiving societies, we miss actual patterns of human mobility, and especially the role of foreign workers in our economies. This assumption of unidirectional mobility, movement towards becoming part of a particular society is what Adrian Fable has called or has referred to as integrationist. We assume that people come to settle and that they follow a pathway to becoming part of us on various dimensions. The assumption is pervasive in everyday life and in the literature on migration. I would add that the assumption of integration is linked to one of permanence for immigrants. So what do we miss when we put on integrationist lenses? Among other patterns, the long-standing role of temporary migration. I'm referring to temporary labor migration schemes and programs. And by that I mean, as you can see on the slide, schemes referring to systematic plans or arrangements to bring workers from another country for a specified duration, usually enforced by the state. These kinds of schemes become programs when states play a central role in recruitment and management of temporary workers. And that has become much more common, especially after World War II, but there are some precursors to this in the early 20th century. And there actually might be some others that are a little earlier, but I'm not going to focus on the historical today. And why are these kinds of temporary programs wherein people come with a contract for a set period of time, why are they appealing? Well, they're sort of a grand, or they're presented as a grand bargain among employers and workers, brokered by sending and receiving states, and to the benefit of migration industry intermediaries. Let me spell out what's appealing for each of the main actors here. So from the perspective of sending states, let's say like the Philippines in particular, or Mexico, they can frame the sending of workers abroad as a developmental strategy, or a strategy of development, and acceptable because it's temporary. Receiving states can secure the needed workers for the national market without introducing more difference. They can tout these programs as not harming national workers and as an alternative to unauthorized migration. Employers, on the other hand, can secure cheap and compliant labor without assuming the costs of labor reproduction, because workers go home when the job is done or at the end of the contract period. So they don't need to assume the costs of workers being around while they're not working. From the perspective of workers, they lower their legal vulnerability because they are authorized workers, even if for a short time. They have increased workplace protections, at least on paper. They make more money than they make at home, or increase their migration capital as part of a stepwise process that Anu Paul has written about. The sacrifices that they endure are bearable because, again, they're temporary. And there are a number of actors who broker among other actors and benefit from it. Oops. Just before I enter into the discussion that I'd like to have today, let me just give you a little bit of background from the rest of the project. So basically, for the last 5 years, I've been exploring the role of temporary migrations, those defined by a state assigned duration, and a large, and this is part of a larger program of examining the role of time in politics. And you may be familiar with the work of Elizabeth Cohen, the political theorist. This was sort of in that vein. What I have discovered in the historical portion of the project, which constitutes the bulk of this project, is that migrations with a legally assigned duration via a contract have been a favored way of managing and shaping national populations while keeping capitalists supplied with a cheap and compliant labor force. Also, indenture was the basic legal script on which temporary labor migration schemes drew. These schemes have been pliable and often work unnoticed to prop up immigration and nationality regimes, especially exclusionary ones. The United States has, for instance, had some form of indenture-like contract in colonial times, and then temporary programs consistently since 1942. The final takeaway from the previous historical work is that temporary labor migration programs allow for ethno-racial selection under the cover of legal neutrality. And I can explain that further if you like, but just to give you a little bit of the context of what has been done in the project so far. I didn't say, but I should have, that if you have questions, clarification questions, please, I don't know, hopefully I'll notice if you raise your hand. I can't see all of you, but maybe someone can alert me to any questions.
I'll help you with that, David.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let me get to the plan for today. I'd like to examine the role of temporary labor migration programs in 4 strategically selected countries over the last couple of decades. And those countries are Australia, Canada, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States. My intention has been for this, or had been for this to be a single chapter, the final chapter in a 6-chapter manuscript, but this is turning out to be a challenge. So we'll see. Today, I'll talk about some of the preliminary findings, and I think you'll see that there's way more here than might be able to, than I might be able to wrestle into a chapter. So specifically, the question that I want to pursue today is about the role of temporary labor migration programs, how they work, and their consequences. I'll focus primarily on the role of these programs, and my argument is that these are state-sponsored schemes in the dual sense of scheme, meaning they are systems of recruiting and organizing needed foreign labor. That's sort of the standard way of thinking about these, but they are also ideological stratagems. That is, that they mobilize the idea of temporariness to reconcile multiple interests shaped by adherence to nation or capital. These programs, they sell the idea that the grand bargain is indeed a win-win-win for states, employers, and workers. This is accomplished through a number of strategies and tactics, all of which build on legal scripts like contracts that match workers to employers for a set time. And I'll talk a little bit about those strategies and tactics in a minute. The consequences vary by actors, but the punchline is that employers are the biggest winners, notwithstanding protestations to the contrary, and probably unsurprisingly. Today, I want to focus on the first argument about the ideological role of these programs, but I will bring in a little bit of information or evidence about mechanisms and consequences. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about data and methods, and I'll do this briefly, and I realize that this will be a bigger deal for this audience than others, so I'm happy to unpack this further, but let me just say a few things. First of all, I draw on official statistics on individuals who are granted temporary or permanent visas since the mid-1990s in the countries that I mentioned earlier. This requires a little bit of what I would call, I guess, forensic accounting, because countries use misleading categories that obscure the scope of temporary migration. And I'll give you some examples of that. So what I'll present are actually pretty conservative figures. So you can pretty much assume that the gap between temporary and permanent visas that I'll show you in a minute is pretty conservative. So that's one set of evidence that I'll draw on today. The other set has to do with an analysis of official sources in Australia, Canada, the UAE, and the US. This includes policy documents, official websites, reports, laws, regulations, audits. And my strategy there has been to collect or to form a corpus, which I jump into DemnThink and then do a coding review of that data. And some of the findings that I'll share with you today have to do with that process. Why did I select these countries? They're all major receiving countries, even though we tend typically to focus on former Anglo-settler states or Western destinations. We all know that if there have been any shifts in the last few decades, it has been in terms of destinations. And one of the major shifts in destination has been toward the what we call the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC countries in the Middle East. If you want to read more on that, there's a 2019 article, I believe, by Heinda Haas that sort of lays out the change in these patterns. So major countries of migration, but they also vary in terms of their migration history, obviously, when it starts and how long it has gone on, the types of political systems that they represent, and also the national population myths. So that this has to do with my strategy of looking for a group of countries that will allow me to extract some lessons from the comparisons across them. So let me talk a little bit about findings here. So in this first chart, you get a sense of the trend in the United States towards temporariness, at least as measured by visas. These are, by the way, these are not entries, but actual visas issued to individuals. So you can see the upward trend basically since the mid-90s, and a dip in 2020 related to COVID. It's harder to get a sense of the stock of temporary work because they're, by definition, they're going back and forth. So at any given time, it's harder to get a sense of what the actual stock is. But this has, again, to do with numbers of entries. Okay, so in Canada, let me see if I need this. With respect to the US, I just want to note also that you'll find these statistics under the category of non-immigrant visas. So in case you were wondering how this is framed from a national perspective, I think it's important to note where these stats come from. Canada. So in Canada, we see a shift in 2006 towards greater temporariness, and subsequently temporary visas have outstripped permanent ones. This goes through 2015. I did include the last 5 years. I have to incorporate those into my spreadsheet, but I think you get a sense. My recollection is that pretty much the trend continues. But you do have also a dip in 2020. Australia, I'm including here, oops. I'm including here the last decades, and the last decade of data before 2017, you see a similar trend. There's some key issues in Australia about what to count as temporary, which I was not fully attuned to when I first compiled statistics in 2018, I believe. And since then, it's become clear, for example, that student visas should be included in the count because students have time-limited visas and can work up to 40 hours every fortnight or 2 weeks, though in practice they work more. And there are a number of industries that rely heavily on the labor of students. So this is one of those sort of opaque patterns that you wouldn't catch until you read a lot of the secondary literature and some of the historical stuff as well. In any case, just to give you a sense of what might change. So these are stats for 2016 and 2017 for student visas. And you can see that that would push up the number of temporary migrants significantly. I'll talk a little bit more about the opaque and the branding practices in Australia in a bit. Okay, so with respect to the UAE, I can't present similar yearly trends because comparable data on migration are very carefully guarded and are also a moot point because the entire migration system in the UAE is a temporary visa migration system. That you are, there is no one there who is not there on it, other than nationals, obviously. So you have citizens, and then every migrant has some sort of temporary visas. That includes me while I worked there for several years. So there are a range of skill sets and so forth represented, but it is the case that it's a very different kind of regime. So in the snapshot, you have a number of factoids that may give you a sense of what's going on in the UAE with respect to migration. What I want to add is that this trend towards temporariness is not just a feature of, I realize the numbers are really small there, sorry. It's not just a feature of the UAE or Australia or Canada or the US. As you maybe can see in this table that I reproduced from Boucher and Guest's book Crossroads, it is the percentage of temporary economic migrants has become, as a share of total migrants, flows actually in this case, is a significant proportion. I'll point to countries like Australia, 58%, Canada, 52%, but look at Bahrain, Kuwait. So several of the Eastern, Oman, 100%. So if you had the UAE on here, it would be 100%. And I suspect they didn't have the UAE because the UAE provides very, very summary data and summarized data, and they're very squeamish about letting that out into the world. So that's one point that you should know. So much so that Guest, or Boucher and Guest, actually, that's wrong, the citation, have talked about this temporariness as a new normal. And you can see the big point here, the big takeaway is that the pink represents temporary visas, and you can see that a significant number of countries have a majority of temporary visa-based regimes. The problem with some of these data is that they focus on 2 to 5 years. And so what I've tried to do is build some data on a longer term trend. So, okay. Yes. I think I'm doing okay on time. Let me get to some of the official source analysis, to use a big bucket for that list of sources that I mentioned earlier. So if the trend toward temporariness is not widely realized even among academics, and much less the public, it is among officials, and it challenges integrationist countries, especially integrationist countries' national imaginings, and therefore it requires some sort of ideological work. And I don't have as sophisticated a definition of ideology as my colleague Matt Desson might. To me, when I think of ideological work, I think of some idea that's put to work for a purpose. And in this case, it's the idea of temporariness put to work to reconcile some of the conflicting messages that might challenge either national imagining, mostly national imaginings in integrationist countries. So as you can see, do you require some sort of justification in integrationist countries like Australia, Canada, and the US? Yes. In the UAE, there is much less of a need to justify labor programs, temporary labor programs, internally anyway, because it never has built itself, the UAE has never built itself as a nation of immigrants. From the get-go, it was very much an ethnic nation, if I can use the term loosely, and it never contemplated a process for naturalization. You will go to the UAE and you will never hear people talk about integration. You will hear people talk about the kinds of relations among different national origin groups, but not integration. So they're not these kinds of programs are not controversial. They constitute, temporary migrants constitute a majority of the population, as I showed you earlier. But temporary workers are not seen as a threat unless they mobilize politically, and the UAE has surveillance strategies to address some of those challenges. So let me talk a little bit about the dispersive strategies and some supporting tactics. And I know that my summaries here are a little telegraphic, but let me tell you what I mean by some of these. So the discursive strategies of integrationist countries are very similar, and they involve portraying workers as economically necessary, not harmful to national workers, an excellent alternative to authorized or unauthorized migration, and a way to, and this is often lost in the discussions, a way to audition prospects for more permanent statuses. And what I mean by that is that countries may use temporary status as a stepping stone to a more permanent kind of status. Australia and Canada are very overt about this. In the US, the temporary labor programs are portrayed as states of exception, even though, as I mentioned earlier, they have been around for a very long time, consistently, at least since 1942 with the start of the Bracero program. Some form of temporary labor migration program has been in place since then. The US also does have some ways of transitioning from one status to the other. They're not as intentional or at least overt about discussing these as the Australians and the Canadians, but you probably have heard in the news or talked to someone who had an H-1B visa and was able to get sponsorship from their employer and so forth. Okay, so the discursive strategy of the UAE is to represent temporary programs as purely transactional. It's part of a contract. You come, you work, you get paid, you leave. And you can do that many times, and people do. Now, geopolitically, the UAE does put sort of a spin on temporary programs, and they present these as a way to engage in positive geopolitical relations, especially in Southeast Asia. There are tactics that support and tweak broader discursive strategies, such as the ones that I've mentioned so far. And let me talk a little bit about the details of those. While Australia is open to its image as a country with high temporary migration, there is still some lingering unease about this. And there are categorical efforts to minimize the extent of temporariness by reframing temporary workers as holiday makers, for example, or people with backpacker visas. These are the kinds of euphemisms that portray what in fact are labor programs as something else. A former student of ours here, Kate Bowman, did quite a bit of work on the US analog of this, a summer exchange program that turns out to be very important to some industries, the food service industry in particular. So there's that sort of reframing happening. Canada wants to ensure that its image as a liberal democratic country is not tarnished by the assumption that more temporary workers come at the expense of rights. And that is the sort of the trade-off that Martin Royce has written about in his book on the price of rights. The US stresses the importance, for example, of high-tech workers on the one hand, and we heard a lot about essential workers, but it depends on circumstance. And incidentally, people don't often, this is not legible to the person on the street. They don't understand necessarily the difference between an essential unauthorized farm worker, for example, and someone who is part of the temporary visa program. I'm guessing that people are much more aware of high-tech workers or high skills types of workers. Let me now talk a little bit about, did I talk about this? Okay, so the UAE. The UAE carefully regulates and monitors and these are the tactics that they use, the transactional nature of its temporary worker programs through a series of diplomatic means, administrative secrecy, secrecy about numbers and rotation of workers, and a legal structure that dates to the trucial states before Great Britain moved out of that region of the world. The most positive presentation of temporariness belies a very careful regulation in all of these countries. And I won't get into the details there for the sake of time. I think I'm at 30 minutes by my clocking. But let me talk a little bit about some of the contradictions, oops, that emerge even as countries try to do some of this ideological work. Well, first of all, it's very hard to deny the statistical rise in temporary programs relative to permanent migration ones. The other hard reality is that there are a number of protections offered by countries for temporary workers, but they tend to be tenuous. Worker exploitation is rampant across these countries, irrespective, incidentally, of political tradition. So I realize that many of us may have read about exploitation in GCC countries, and it certainly has happened. But I invite you to read some of the reports on wage theft, for example, in Australia, that are really eye-opening. The other thing that I would note in terms of contradictions is that employers and other actors who share employer interests pretty much drive these programs, especially in integrationist countries. You'll see, for example, in the audits of Canada, there's the stellar exemplar of temporary migration programs that the language that they use with respect to employers is client. And their interest is in these audits determining whether they are meeting the needs of clients. That is not to say that they don't have a program to look out for the rights of workers. Just that there are some significant contradictions between the self-presentation on these issues and what actually happens. And finally, I'll skip ahead that, well, no, I want to say two things. One is that temporary labor migration programs in integration countries, as I mentioned earlier, allow for some status transitions. This means that they face the challenge of difference given the origins of migrants. You'll recall the often cited phrase by the famous Swiss writer, Max Frisch, who said, and I'm going to give you the full quote because we usually get the second part of it, "A small master race feels itself endangered. They called for workers and they got people instead." And I'm sure you've heard some version of this in the past, but that sort of captures one of the issues with guest worker or temporary programs, and that is that to the extent that they have ways of transitioning into more permanent statuses, they introduce the kind of difference that many countries were trying to avoid by using these kinds of programs in the first place. The final thing I'll say about this, about the contradictions, is that despite the temporariness of, and even the extreme temporariness of some programs, in terms of how this is experienced from the perspective of workers, it turns into a condition of permanent temporariness, as someone has written, and that's by virtue of serial renewals of temporary visas. Okay, I think I see that there are some comments. Okay.
Thank you very much, David. Folks have any questions, comments? Lori.
Now, David, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. And I'm just thinking of what a gift it is to get to hear about your research. And so I have several things running through my mind, but I'm gonna start with where we sort of, and I see the Colorado slide where we recently corresponded. So as you were speaking, I was thinking about just how much environmental chaos is driving so much migration in our world right now, and I know there are some experts on that topic on the call right now too. And I just wonder if you could talk to us about sort of in these 4 countries, as these temporary migration programs get laid out, is it predominantly, as you said, the businesses that are driving it, but then what's sort of the intersection of environmental degradation, capitalist greed, and so forth? And so can you talk to us about sort of what are those underlying social and environmental and political drivers that are then resulting in the programs? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all. And I've lost my cursor. Okay, here we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, these are very long-term programs that have a very long history, at least a couple of decades, in many instances more than that. In the Middle Eastern instance, these kinds of arrangements date back to colonial times, and not necessarily to what we now know as the UAE, but certainly to Oman and the region. I will say that in the last couple of decades, and I'm speaking here as a non-expert, but my sense is that folks, especially in the Indian Ocean region, and if you think of some of the things that are happening in the Bundarbans and places where Jane is or places that Jane is familiar with, you see a continued push to participate in some of these programs because simply there are no other alternatives, or they are being used as a stepping stone. No matter how bad these are at the very entry level, they're being used as stepping stones to something else that can hopefully get people out of those regions that are under climate, say, under severe climate threat, because we all are, as we've discovered in our protected little part of the world, right? So that, I think that's all that I can say without really starting to speculate. But so there's that going on, but the majority of this is, in the case of the UAE, for example, is coming from India, from Kerala in India. So on the other side, a relatively well-off region, yeah, so I don't know, I can't speak to what's pushing people in detail from some of those places. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk more about the other cases too.
Thanks, David. There's a question in the chat by Jocelyn West, and then Jason and Christy have questions as well. You want me to read it, or?
Yeah, I can read it. Okay, so from Jocelyn.
Yeah, or Jocelyn, you can read it too.
Hi, I could read it for everyone quickly, but yeah, I was just wondering if you could say more about the why, in terms of why you think temporariness as a concept is effective. Like why does that convince people to see migration as less concerning or threatening for various reasons?
Right. Okay, so I want to clarify. I had a slide earlier that talked about why it's appealing to different, and I think we need to break it down by different actors, right? And why it's appealing to them. What I want to clarify is that the basis of appeal may not actually bear out in reality, but nevertheless, people think of this as a way to reconcile multiple interests, especially from a state perspective. And from the perspective of migrants who are faced with very few avenues of exit, assuming that that's what they want to do, this is one that allows them to avoid the worst aspects, the cost of crossing borders, the legal vulnerability costs of being in a place without a legal status, especially given the level of surveillance in most major receiving countries. So I would break it down by actor, and then I would focus on what they perceive might be the payoff, even if we know, in fact, that that doesn't always turn out to be the case. Also happy to talk more about that if you'd like.
Thank you.
Thanks. Jason.
So I hate to be the broken record guy here. And if I'm allowed to, I'll ask two embedded questions. You've mentioned a lot about actors and you've spelled out some of these, but there's one major actor that's very, very different across these 4 states, and that's organized labor and in the presence of unions, where you have places where they're either formal or informally integrated into legislative decisions. In the case of UAE, 0, not a single actually organized labor organization in the state. How do you tell this story, a historical story, if you will, without thinking about the influence of labor unions? And does it change any way your interpretation of how, when, and why, and who makes these decisions of temporary or long-term migration?
Yeah.
And I'll put my embedded one in after that one.
Okay, so I should answer now?
Yeah.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. That's a really important actor that I should have specified more about under the rubric of workers. Workers is not as monolithic a bucket, as we'll say, as you might think, right? So you have national workers. I'm staying away from domestic because that has other implications in this global context. So national workers, you have workers who come from other countries, and you have organized national workers. And absolutely, it is the case that they have influenced the contracts, the kind of contracts. Oh, and I should also mention labor on the sending side as well. Okay, so in any case, they have shaped contracts, the stipulations of contracts, the conditions of labor, and so forth. In some instances, they have organized labor has resisted temporary programs because of the impact that they could have on national labor. But there is no doubt that their participation has, at least on paper, made the conditions better for foreign workers. Having said that, of course, what you see, even in a place like Canada, is that often these contracts and stipulations are co-opted by the state. And remember, the state is handling most of this, right? So in their role, they can really attenuate the extent to which these protections actually are effective. It's more complicated than that, but that's my first take at it. Embedded question.
Thank you. Christy.
My quick embedded question is, maybe it's not too quick, I'm sorry. I just invited Theta Scotchball into the room, and you get to tell her why this is so important in less than 30 seconds.
Why is politics? I didn't hear the, sorry.
I said, you know, Theta Scotchball is sitting in this conversation, and she has access to Zoom. And what do you anticipate she's going to ask you or say? I wrote that 40 years ago. Tell her why she needs to pay attention to your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I think part of what, leaving aside revolutions, I think part of what she would raise would have to do with state capacity. And there's an embedded story about the growth of state capacity. The very fact that I shifted from the language of temporary labor migration schemes to temporary labor migration programs suggests that states have been on a process of taking over these processes that in the past were simply either run by employers or private entities, or they were just seasonal migrations. So there's an embedded story of growing state capacity that leads to the very possibility of state programs, of temporary programs.
So I was just saying thank you, and my first thought is good luck putting this into one chapter. So that'll be fun for you. So just kind of building off, Jocelyn and Jason's comments of actors, right? I really think, and what you said at the end of really kind of trying to draw out, both look at the full display of actors and draw the connections between, different actors and different conversations. So one of them, which you don't need to talk about now, but is, when you're talking about the state, you were saying kind of they, right? And I was really curious about like who's they at the top. But my question is actually about kind of the recipients of these supposedly racial neutral messages, because if it's the public, I wasn't so convinced that, the public has, sees a distinction between, temporary and permanent migration, and xenophobia will probably, kind of railroad its way through that distinction. So when I was really intrigued about the idea of this, kind of, stealthy way to, shape ethno-racial populations. But when you're talking about that particular piece of the argument, who's kind of getting the wool pulled over their eyes, or who's being, I'm interested in kind of the subject of that, particular strategy.
Okay, that's a huge question, but really important. Let me see if I can do something relatively okay and short. I think that we tend to think about this in terms of intentional actors. And so state officials making these decisions, and usually I'm talking about in this case because they play such a central role, them, or legislators or policymakers making decisions about using this. But the intentional portion of assumption here, I think, detracts from sort of the broader origins or the historical origins of something like a contract, which has the appearance of neutrality. We ascribe to it neutrality because it's a contract, it's legal, right? And not only that, it's a contract based on ascribed skill. So these are written according to skill. And so I think it's very easy to make the case that these are neutral in terms of ethno-racial selection. However, when you look at the actual populations that end up coming, they are remarkably similar in origins to the folks who in the past we excluded through immigration and nationality policies. So whatever is going on in terms of intentions, I don't know, I'm not making that claim, but the outcome is very similar. And I think that does appeal at the policy level, that you can make these claims to neutrality because the way that they're working out for various reasons, that the key thing would be to unpack the mechanisms, right, by which this happens. But the fact is that that's the profile of temporary migrant that we're ending up with. I don't know if that begins to approximate an answer for you.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Echoing other people in the chat. Thank you very much, David. I'm going to cut myself for time. I'll send you my question, or hopefully we can chat about it sometime. But in the meantime, thank you very, very much for a very interesting talk. And yes, good luck fitting that into one chapter. Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you all next time.
Take care.